Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. We are honored to have Dr. Paul White again here on the Fired Up with CJ show. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm glad to be back.
And we are talking about two things. One is we're talking about these booklets that Dr. Paul White talked about during our last show. One is how to decide when it's time to quit your job, which I hear a lot as a coach. And then the second one is, which I don't hear as much, and I think that we should be thinking about, is how to avoid being hired by a toxic workplace. So we're going to talk about these items. So the most depressing thing was reading the first paragraph here. Gallup poll found that 50% of the workers either are enduring their current job or actively hate it.
Right.
That's a little bit depressing to me.
Yeah. I mean, it is unfortunate. And the numbers have been going down over the past, I don't know, 5 to 10 years of how much people enjoy their work or how much they're sort of emotionally engaged. And
hmm
it's a problem. I think there's a number of factors that contribute to it. But regardless, as individuals, we need to sort of figure out what we can do to make it different so that we're not just passive victims of external circumstances.
Now, here's the one thing that's always hard as a coach. I listen. I'm like, okay, so what's happening with your office, and it's usually one triggering person that creates like toxicity for me. At least,
Right.
if I were to create
Yeah.
like a trend analysis of what I hear over and over again, it's like one person that creates like a pallor of misery across a group of people. It's either the
Yep.
boss or even one person within the group that has an exponentially large power or above and beyond their position, but they create this kind of awful toxic experience. And and I never really know what to say because sometimes it's because I approach it from a spiritual perspective. Sometimes I think, well, this is for your spiritual growth. This person is your
Mhm.
teacher,
Right.
learn from it. And, before you leave it, or because the desire is like, I gotta get out of here like tomorrow. And it's like,
Right.
well, that may not be the best idea because just jumping and fleeing from something, you're escaping a possible learning opportunity, a possibility for your soul to learn something.
Hmm.
Possible because obnoxious people are always going to be there.
They exist and they're everywhere. You know,
Exactly.
I
So,
mean, they're in your family and they're your neighbors and every place. So yeah. So I mean, that is. I think it's a great point that we don't want to just jump from a difficult situation because there are opportunities to learn and grow.
hmm
And that's true. And that's there's this thing called wisdom
hmm
that we all long for and desire that gives us the discernment of when to do what, right? Because that's
hmm
part of life is not just what to do, but when to do it.
hmm
And sort of that whole thing about jumping, I got some great advice from a colleague that I worked with for a number of years, and he said, always try to make sure that you're not in a desperate situation because when you're in a desperate situation, that's when we really don't make good decisions,
yeah.
right? And so, like leaving a job, I think if you really dislike what's going on and it's, not getting any better and it doesn't look like it's going to be, you need to try to plan ahead some so that you don't get to the breaking point where you just, blow up and quit and then you don't have anything going. And so, I think there's an old saying about, a wise person can see what's coming and make adjustments. And that's true in the workplace too. It's sort of like, hopefully, like Blockbuster Video. I mean, they were all over the place and then technology changed and boom, they're gone. Well, somebody with wisdom might see that ahead of time. But at an individual level, I'm not sure how much longer I can take this. Well, at that point, you better be starting to look at options and getting prepared to get out there, whether that's, your resume or talking to people, networking, making sure you have some skills or qualifications that are needed so that you sort of decide when you want to leave versus you can't take it anymore or they let you go.
Yeah. My mama always said, don't get, don't leave a job until you find another one.
It's typically, for most of us, that's good advice.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, and I think that what I'm hearing you say is a very similar kind of thing. Don't jump ship, even if it's the most awful job, without actually having a game plan and something, at least some type of plan executed, because the desperate part is it's the hardest time to find a job when you're, and I've also heard, and I think that this is true too, is that if it's a lot easier to find a job when you're in a job. When you're out of a job, you have your, like, I have contact me at my Gmail address or my,
Right.
whatever. It's like,
Yeah.
uh-oh, like something has
Yeah.
happened to this person, that they're no
Right.
longer at their, Microsoft address or whatever. So, and it kind
Yeah.
of leads, like, has this kind of like, a wonder what happened. Why did
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
leave? Was it a problem? Was it their problem? And because people don't know, there's
Although
this
I would
pallor.
say that I was going to say, I think that's generally true, but I think there are times when you got to get out. And another sort of backup plan is to make sure you've got enough funds to
Hmm.
last for 3 months or whatever, or that you realize, hey, I don't mind going and working some lower level job to pay the bills while I figure out or get trained to do the next. I don't think it has to be a, back to back, but you got to have some margin in there. Otherwise, it could be pretty tough.
Yeah, the financial planners that say, I think it's like having 3 months of reserve. Like, you actually have a safe and sound, so you need to actually have 3 months, and I would say up to 3 to 6 months of just float.
Yep.
And they say that, I think, because I also say it takes about 3 to 6 months to find another job. I mean, unless you jump into another job, just leap into something else, just anything, just to bring in
Right.
money. If you want to move consciously into another job, I think it takes 3 to 6 months. And I think the thing that you're talking about is what in my line of work is called a transition plan, where you
Hmm.
say you don't want to necessarily jump from one thing to another, but you can transition into consulting,
Right.
or working at Starbucks, or working at retail, or some type of job that you say, by this date I'm going to leave. Because sometimes I've seen something else where people don't want to leave a toxic work environment. Like, it's almost like breaking up is really hard for them, so they
Right.
stay way past their expiration date. And that,
Absolutely.
yeah, that also creates this kind of icky feeling that also erodes your confidence over time. So sometimes I just have them pick, like, just pick a date. That's the date that you're going to leave. And then pick up, and as part of that plan, pick up a transition plan so you can figure out, like, what are you going to do in between then to actually make money, and how much money do
Yeah.
you need to make? Um,
Right.
I think those are all relevant questions. What do you, what's your rule of thumb?
Well, yeah, I think 3 to 6 months. But the bigger question, I think, getting to how do you know when to quit? There's two parts. One is the signs. I can tell you that. But the other one is almost always we stay out of fear. And I think it's really wise for people to look at what those fears are, and how real or reality based they are. I mean, it's like, oh, I'll never get a job, or whatever. And there are some reality based ones that it may take me 3, 6, or more months, and so I better have some backup plan. But often there's other things in there about identity, about people are going to think I'm a failure, or I just did another radio interview where a caller came in and said they felt loyal to the company, and I just said, hey, look, I'm sure it's a fine place maybe, but organizations, they survive, and
Right.
you may be great and you may be key, but they're going to figure out a way to get along without you. And so trying to continue for their sake is not a good reason to do it. And especially in sort of mission driven organizations, whether that's,
Mm,
not for profits or social service or even, ministry kinds of things, you can get really hooked into, if you're really committed, you'll give everything. Well, they'll suck you dry and spit you out and you die on the side of the road and they keep going. And so you've got to set some boundaries. I don't mean to sound so bad, but I mean, it's true. I mean, organizations learn how to survive,
yeah, don't work for a
and
nonprofit. It's awful.
No, 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 no.
No, I'm
But I mean,
joking.
it can be for a corporate too, but they care about themselves, and you've got to take care of yourself, and that's the issue. The key issue is when you feel like you're dying, and that not just and physically sometimes too. I mean, because one of the things that happens when we are in a really really bad workplace is we don't sleep as well, we worry a lot, we start missing those healthy habits of exercising, and we start eating more or drinking more or whatever it is. We start to withdraw socially. People don't want to be around us because we're irritable or we're just passive and apathetic. And so when your health starts to go, that's sort of like the beginning of the end. I mean, because when we start sleeping well, lots of bad things happen, right? And
Hmm.
we don't think straight, we don't respond well emotionally, relationally. And so when you're starting to have those physical symptoms and it's sort of, rolling down, that's when you got to take a serious look. And I think it's also helpful to ask somebody that you trust close to your life, whether it's family or friends, and say, you know, how do you think I'm doing? Or you need to listen when they say, are you okay? Because you seem really different and not so good. We should really value friends and family who
Hmm.
say those things to us, and we need to listen to it
Hmm.
rather than say, well, you don't, I'm just going to buck up for a little bit more. There's always going to be a little bit more. So,
Well, the thing that you just mentioned, and you have in your book, the physical health signs, weight gain, frequent headaches, digestive problems, increased health problems or accidents, difficulty sleeping, and your coping mechanisms, over the counter medications, prescription medications, increased use of alcohol, marijuana, or mood altering drugs, excessive use of computer, watching TV and movies, social withdrawal, excess spending. Like these are all kind of the warning signs. And it's interesting. I would add another one based on
great.
my own husband's experience, who worked at a nonprofit. He was an
Uh,
executive director of a nonprofit, and I don't mean to dig on nonprofits, but here's why nonprofits I think have that, because the risk is so large. Like the litmus test at Microsoft, as we used to say, is any child going to die? And if not, then like, why are you worrying about this too
right,
much? But for nonprofits, actually, a little child may die. So like the when you decide that you're going to quit, there's actually real human consequences afterwards. So that's a hook, and that shouldn't necessarily keep you from staying there, but it's more of an emotional hook. So
right.
I get that. And so my husband stayed, I would say probably a year and a half, two, beyond what he really wanted to do. And he did
Hmm.
it for all of the reasons. But, and it was just as like a record player over and over, complaining about the same things over and over and over again. And it starts to actually. I love my husband, so I'd be like, "I get it, honey," and you can't go like, "Just leave," just
Right, right,
you just go, yeah. If you find yourself complaining about your job for a year and a half,
right,
then maybe
right.
it's time to go. Um, so I think that so there's two sides of the coin. One where you stay past your expiration date, like it's not healthy for you.
Hmm.
And you also talk about other things like anxiety, anger, irritability, discouragement, depression, hopelessness, lack of energy, increased forgetfulness, disorganization, feeling overwhelmed, not able to handle typical responsibilities, no time and energy for others in your life. These, frankly, are all signals. They're a signal of stress, right? You're under
Right.
distress. Um, so there are those kinds of things, and even in those kinds of things, I think the game plan is still the same, don't you? Like
Yeah, but if you listen to the symptoms, and by the way, it's like, well, everybody could say, well, I got that, I got that, and
yeah,
that, but it's both. It's the number of symptoms, it's the frequency of the symptoms, how the duration, how long they've been going on, the intensity of them, and so when it starts to add up and snowball, I mean, that's worse when you got 10 or 15 of those versus two, right? But the other part is if you listen, passivity, lack of energy, poor decision making. You don't want to make a transition plan when you don't have any energy, low self esteem, and all that. I mean, you've got to save something for that transition because it takes emotional energy. So if you burn it all up, at the current place, you're not going to have much to put forth, to look for something else.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. And another thing that I've noticed is that when people, in order to leave your current job, you have to actually have an energy reserve, like after work or
Yep.
during work. You can't give it 100%. You have to give it 60% so that you can use
Right.
that other 40% to network and do other things. That's a hard thing. What would you tell folks who are like, well, Paul, I can't, like, I'm going to get fired from my job if if I don't work at 110%. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say your first responsibility is to yourself, and you've got to take care of yourself, and I would include your family with that. And if they're demanding or requiring more than what is good for you long term, I mean, there's short periods where you got to give extra and all that. But if they just have these expectations that are way up there that it takes everything you've got plus more to get it done, it's probably not a good match.
Right.
And so you got to figure out how to get out there because their expectations probably aren't going to change. And you do your job the best you can. I'm not saying, you should, ditch it, but, do what you can and let the chips fall where they may because you've got to reserve some stuff for yourself and figuring out what's going on.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting is I think that rarely happens that a place fires you because you're working at 80 to 90% versus 110. They got so many other things going on. And you mentioned about toxic people being sort of the main thing. That's true, but it takes a certain set of characteristics in an environment for a toxic person to grow or flourish. I mean, if you think about sort of
Mm,
like a garden or something physical,
mm,
you know, algae or fungus doesn't just grow on its own everywhere. There's got to be some characteristics
mm-hmm.
that warrant the growth, and so it's not just an individual, but there's usually some other patterns and characteristics that allow that fungus to grow and create toxins.
Okay, my next question. What is the environment that allows that fungus to grow and take hold?
Yeah. So what's interesting, I think we talked about, I wrote this book on toxic workplaces, and then I kept researching and developed a training program on how to avoid becoming a toxic workplace. And one of the key things is a sick system is sort of part of that environment. And a sick system has poor communication in the sense that not just, that people aren't great at communicating, but I mean, it's like the message doesn't get from where it needs to go, from where it is to
Mm,
where it needs to go.
mm-hmm.
And a lot of indirect communication, bad decision making policies, so that people that are making decisions that they really aren't over that. I mean, it happens a lot in family businesses where somebody that's sort of outside the system decides that they're going to decide for somebody else. Clearly, a lack of monitoring and holding people accountable for the decisions and mistakes. So people are just skating. So why should they make a different decision? Um, and that whole kind of thing that just goes, and it happens in bureaucracies a lot, especially government agencies, hospitals, universities, some social service agencies, because they've got so many different people they're sort of reporting to. You've got the medical staff and you've got administrators. It just gets crazy. Well, a
Mm.
lot of bad things can sort of sneak in there, and people can sort of weasel it, and then things go bad.
Mm,
So does that
right.
make sense?
Yes, it's kind of like I almost think of it as a too busy parent. You know how parents are running around and they have like
Yeah.
multiple people that they're trying to serve. They're running around, they're doing this and they just lose track. They don't communicate well. They don't pick up things well. Things go wrong and
And
they're
and the
not
focus is
accountable.
on image.
Yeah,
That's a key issue
yeah,
because they want to look like a good parent. They want to look like a successful parent or professional, whatever. And so they're doing the image thing, but the real stuff isn't happening. And that
yeah,
happens in companies too, where they want to look like they're good to their
yeah.
employees,
I'm
but
got my act
they
together,
aren't. And
but they
everybody
don't.
that works there,
Yes,
yeah,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
And because image control takes a lot of energy.
Yeah, it does. Interesting. So those are kind of Those are the things that allow the fungus or whatever the algae to grow in the first place is just not having a healthy culture that communicates, has accountability. That what was the other one? Accountability,
Decision
communication,
making, follow through, monitoring.
mission, follow through. Yeah, yeah, pretty simple. They're kind of basic kind of things.
Kind of basic stuff, but you'd be amazed at how a lot of organizations don't have that sort of in their DNA, that it's more about sort of reacting to the environment or building an image of looking good.
Mm, I do. I have seen that before. Okay, so the question though that you would ask yourself if you're an employee of one of these is, what has been the duration, the frequency that this has happened, the intensity of the behaviors? You say, how many problem behaviors are there, and are there how many people are displaying these behaviors regularly, and what solutions have been tried? And the thing that I notice of these types of questions, it's usually one or two. It's not like it's some of it's an endemic. Like there's some organizations that are just sick, like through and
Right,
through. They're just
right.
sick, and it's like everyone
Not
does
to
this,
name
or
any, but maybe Congress, I
yeah,
mean, so.
not a ton. Yeah, no, but we're like everyone has this kind of like just awful kind of a
Yeah.
sense like hopelessness. Um, so, but what's interesting is what solutions they've tried. Oftentimes, people don't try any solutions. Have you noticed that, or what do you hear
Well,
as?
they do, or they try some one little thing one time and say, well, we tried that, which is, it's sort of like, trying to lose weight. Well, I went to the gym, on January 4th and it didn't make any difference. So you give it up. I mean, so lots of times what they've tried, it's been sort of, a token try, if you will, rather than a persistent one and clearly not a strategic one, right? I mean, and so there's different levels of implementing change within an organization. And most of us, you know, we may have some realm of authority or responsibility, but most of us aren't at the top. I
Hmm.
mean, just by definition. But we have ourselves and the people that we interact with, and we need to start there. Otherwise, it gets into that sort of blame game and whining and complaining
Hmm.
about everybody
Hmm.
else, and that doesn't help.
Right. So it's actually, I think you're right that we often feel like, oh, I did that. Well, I'm not going to bother doing it again because I tried it and it didn't work. So I think that that's one. And what is the impact on the organization resulting? What is the impact on the organization resulting from negative behaviors and characteristics? What did you mean by that?
So when bad going on, what's the result? And it can be that people feel free to come in at whatever time of day they
Ah.
want, come back from breaks late, back from lunch break late, or they don't they want to make the decision and they don't really like this supervisor, so they just go around them. So they just make decisions and send it off this way, and all of a sudden, they're sort of taking responsibility for things that they didn't know about also impacted some other department. And so this, sales or marketing gets screwed
Mm.
up. So, usually bad behaviors result in bad results. It may take a little while for them to show up, but you're going to see it. Or, somebody, just a person that's got an anger problem and they're just, barking and yelling. It's like, well, people, they're not going to tell them the truth about some problem because they don't want to get yelled at, or they tell somebody else, or they talk about it. I mean, there's indirect stuff, or they avoid them. Um, so there's results that happen practically.
Humans are so complex. Yeah. Just say, you know,
Yeah.
I just got back from a 1 week meditation retreat. And I think human
Cool.
systems, wherever they exist, right, even in a meditation retreat where people have been meditating for like 20, 30, whatever years, and in theory have had a higher degree of consciousness, the same human dynamics when you get groups of people together always exist. These tensions happen. And really, it's the thing that you had mentioned. It's as a leader, what are you going to do when these, and as member, what are you going to do, right? Are you going to let someone rob you of your power, or you know what I mean, or erode your self
Hmm.
confidence? Like and it's never just a one way street. It's always like a two-way street. So
Sure.
you know what I mean? So if someone is like yelling at you, you can be like, why are you yelling at me? I don't understand. It seems like you're getting angry all the time, and that's not really cool by me for you yelling at me because this report wasn't done. Can't we, like, do you know
Right.
what I mean? That's not just this kind of, I just sit there
Yeah, no, it's an
passively.
interaction effect. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's an interaction effect. I mean, that's the nature of relationships. You have a person and another person, and they interact, and the interaction is affected by each person, as well as their, environment and also their state of being, and maybe what recently happened. And so there's so many variables, but ultimately, yeah, I mean, somebody can yell at us, but we have a choice, right? I
right.
mean, how to respond, not respond, kick it up a notch, whatever. And at some point, we have to take responsibility for our responses because, I mean, you live with it. And so if you don't want to respond, then they'll keep yelling,
Right.
potentially. And if that's the way you want to live, then you can live that way.
Right.
But,
Well, even if that person is in power, right? Like, even if that person is in
yeah,
power and they're yelling at you, it doesn't mean it's acceptable. And
right.
you have your right to say, like, it's not okay with me when you yell like that for me. It scares me or it irritates me or it's just not professional or whatever. But I think that a lot of people, when they're in those toxic behaviors, they don't really know how to respond, right? Because it's not just this one way thing. It's try to respond to the person and see if your response shifts their response, and it could kind of change the ecosystem. Just you kind of pointing out something that someone didn't even
Mhm.
know was part of this ecosystem that they're a part of. So I don't know. I think it's a if you're in one of these places, look at like what are you doing? If you're in a toxic workplace, what are you doing to create that toxicity? And if you're relating to it to a certain way, it's like what they talk about bullies in the playground. Like if you're just allowing and seeing someone being bullied and you're sitting there complicitly sitting there watching, then you're part of the
You're part
problem.
of it. You're part of the system. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. It seems like, try to address it yourself. Try to go to the proper channels to address it. And then if nothing happens, then I think it's like, okay, time to go, time to go. Like it's just not, it's like you've tried everything. It's time to go.
Well, let's take it down to a more specific example. Let's say you're in an interaction with your boss, your supervisor, and they're getting upset and they start yelling and get intense. Y- you can try in that interaction to try to, first of all, acknowledge that, hey, I see you're getting upset. Something about this is bothering you, so that hopefully they'll hear that. That may or
De-escalate
may
it.
not work. Okay. Or you can try to give them information that they're misunderstanding. That tends to not help it too much at that
No,
point.
they can't even hear
Uh,
you.
and at some point, even in that situation, you say, this is not really working for me, and I'm concerned about where this is going. So what I'm going to do is, I'm more than willing to talk about this when we're both calm, or we can do it through writing.
Totally
But
fine.
I
Yeah.
I I don't want to sit here and just be yelled at. And now you have to think through. Now this might really torque this person off, and they're going to say, "Well, you leave the room, you're out of here for good." You have to decide. Say, "Well, it's not that important to me. I'll sit here and you can yell at me because I don't want to lose my job
Right.
today." Or you can say, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. Talk to HR, and my attorney will call yours. I mean,
Right.
I get a little lippy when I'm not in the situations, but uh, but you have to think through those consequences,
Yeah.
and it's best to think through it ahead of time because when your sort of limbic brain takes over and you got those emotions flowing, it's hard to think clearly. But you always have a choice, and I mean, I had a situation like that this week where I had a communication that was misread by the other person, and man, they sort of blew up. Well, first of all, I didn't have to respond right away, and so
Mm.
I've learned, I'm old enough. I've learned to sort of
Yes.
slow things
Type the
down.
email,
It,
go the next morning, and then look at it and go like,
yeah,
I don't want to send that.
yeah, and I bounced it off of a couple of colleagues, and it is what it is, and who knows where I'll go. It doesn't,
Yeah.
so. But we need to think through the things like that. I guess part of it that you mentioned about sort of the toxic culture and all of that is sometimes we need to be aware that our culture is not all external. That we're part of
That's a good
what makes
point.
our culture exist.
Really
And
good point.
so you can't most of us can't influence the whole organization, but we can influence those that we have daily interactions with. And so what we bring to that, what we leave out as far as negativity and complaining, that helps shape at least this little area of culture around me that becomes part of this person's culture that can maybe influence the rest. And over time, we can start to have an influence. So sometimes I get concerned that people don't understand about what culture is. And it's not just, I mean, there's a lot of things that make up culture. I mean, it's words, it's interactions, it's also visual symbols. I
Mm.
mean, if I have an office and I have a bunch of weapons on my walls, you know, that's that's different than if I have nature pictures. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's, you know, we don't always. Maybe a bad example, I'm
No,
sorry,
I get it.
but
No, because I was on an airplane just recently, and there were two people on two separate flights, and each of them were perusing gun magazines and like why we need guns, and I was like, and it scared. Actually, it scared me just sitting next to them because I thought one weird move and like
right,
the guy's gonna
right,
shoot me. Like it makes a difference what you have on your wall.
yeah.
But go continue.
Well, I was just going to say, as we're leaders, we can make an influence of what's on our walls, or if there's music playing, or what you send out on your emails, and if there's a fun little saying at the end or whatever. Those kinds of things. Culture is made up of a lot of little
Yeah.
things, and often it's symbolic. In other words, if you think about a culture, pick any kind of ethnic culture, it's not just words, right? It's symbols, it's art, it's music, it's food. And so that's some ways that we can start to
Mm.
influence our environment. Because if you have food, and share that and it's relatively healthy, that's better than, either not anything. I always tell people, don't bring celery and light ranch and expect anybody to be encouraged. I
Right.
mean, that just doesn't, but so,
That'll
but,
just make people even more grumpy.
exactly. But I'm just trying to expand our vision of how we can influence those around us versus feeling like we're a passive victim.
Yeah.
We aren't in control of everything around us, but we can influence other things.
I love the idea of maybe bringing like a chips and salsa thing, like, hey, chips and salsa time. Just everyone break. And, because what they say, I have a nutritionist, and she said that what happens is that when you're feeling stress, what people like to do is chew. And so, why we often overeat and seek crunchy items is because we're under stress and we want to chew with our jaws to get the tension out. So maybe
Yeah.
some carrots, because she said, so when you get hungry, eat carrots. And I'm like, oh, great. But I
Well,
think
and
chips has
the
the
other
same
thing is
thing.
when you're having a big meeting, a decision-making meeting, or you're trying to do a presentation that's important, you want to make sure it's not at 11:30 in the morning or at 4 in the afternoon, because when people's blood sugar is down, interactions don't go well. So you either going to bring something for them to eat and snack on, or you schedule it earlier in the day, because our blood sugar and food and all that kind of stuff makes a difference. And if you see really masterful negotiators or influencers, they've set the environment, and it includes visual things, it includes food, it includes sort of introductions and all that. So we need to pay attention to those.
Yeah, I like that idea. I like the idea that I like the analogy that you just gave of a culture is just like any other culture. The Chinese culture it has, or the Hispanic culture, like that has foods and traditions and rituals and subtle little
Right.
things that we say and hangings and furniture. Like there's a whole thing that makes up a culture, not just one. But I do think one toxic person, even in that culture, can create,
Sure.
like someone who's kind of emotionally toxic. And like you said, it's what I like is that it's internal ecology, because you could have someone who's really toxic, but if you have, like, you have a bully, right? But you have everyone who stands up to the bully. After a while, like, even that toxic person can be
Sure.
contained.
Well, a healthy system and environment. By the way, I got to plug my new book. It's called The Vibrant Workplace, and
Yes.
it's overcoming the obstacles to building a culture of appreciation. And when we go in and talk about the five language of appreciation over the past 7 or 8 years, found out okay, there's some different common obstacles because when you change or try to change, there's obstacles, right? And so there's common ones, but a healthy system not only grows, but it also protects and can react to infection or things that are attacking you. So
Yes.
if you think about our body, yeah, we grow and build healthy, but we
Mm.
also have a defense system, and that's
Mm.
true in a healthy work environment. It's
Yes.
like you said, if somebody's doing something negative, there should be a healthy, helpful response, not
Mm.
just passive, because otherwise it sort of gives it the freedom to grow.
Yeah.
So we've got to set some boundaries and say, this isn't acceptable here. Now, if you want to do that over here, go have a nice time, but we're not doing that here,
Right.
either in this time or place or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that idea. And I think that we don't, I don't think leaders think about that much. They don't think about, it's like, oh, well, let's just fire that person. No, well, you can also develop, a sort of system or a way of dealing with it so that when that comes up, there's like a healthy response of like, no, that's not, like you said, it's not acceptable. You can do, it's acceptable over there, including like acceptable out of this company. But like, here's what's acceptable
Exactly.
here,
Right.
and you can do this, but in these situations, but not whatever you're doing because it's not cool. It's hard though, because like I've had, and I think you probably have had this if you've worked with government agencies and large bureaucracies. Sometimes those toxic people, you can't fire them. There's like a long procedural process before they're fired.
Right.
So that threat is not even a possibility. So, what would you recommend in cases like that where it's like, I can't fire this person? I'm going to have to deal, even if I threaten to fire them, I still have six
Yeah.
months of whatever this chaos is happening.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. I just spoke to a state conference of HR professionals,
Hmm.
and they know all about that kind of stuff. And one tactic is you've got to set up whatever their review process is to not only include traditional performance measures, but also collaborative work. Being respectful. Not being condescending or whatever. You've got to set up the sort of those soft skill things too, that where they're, or being willing to follow instructions, from your
Yeah,
director or whatever,
those are
and
great.
so that you can set up sort of the pathway to eventually be able to fire them. But the other thing you can do is you can just sort of set them off in left field where, they're just by themselves and you can't fire them, but, you can open all envelopes. I mean, I'm being facetious here, but I mean, you sort of, to the best of your ability, set them aside and limit the damage that they can
Right, like
do.
work at home,
Yeah.
work at
Or, yeah.
home or remotely 3 days out of the week or
Yeah, or
whatever.
if you've got an issue, you talk to this person. Don't talk to anybody else, and you talk to this person, and they will deal with it, and they'll talk to me or whatever. But I don't want you talking to that supervisor, your colleagues, whatever. You got an issue, either a complaint or something you want done, and so you sort of fence them off a little bit, um, so you limit how much they damage other people.
Yeah, I mean that's what they do. In nature, if you actually have like something that is going to hurt all the other trees, you like protect the other trees from that
Yep.
infected tree. So why wouldn't you? Or a dog that bites, you put them in a cage and you don't let them run about.
Right.
That's that's brilliant. I have so many. I have so many clients that I'm going to send this interview to. They need to hear. It's very hard when you're a manager dealing with all these things. I don't think that you have to be somewhat of a manager and a psychologist at the same time. Because I
Right.
don't, there's so many, because you're dealing with so many human emotions that it's very hard to actually, I think it's hard as a manager. You may actually be able to do your job competently and, an expert and have the expertise, but all these things that we're talking about are emotional issues, right?
Yeah, and I think it's helpful for people to understand themselves and say, look, it's sort of the old, there's two types of people in the world, okay? And there's a type of person that reacts too soon and impulsively, okay? I fall on that. If I'm going to err,
Me
I go
too.
too fast,
Yep.
okay? And then there's other people that tend to get passive and paralyzed and never move, right?
Hmm.
And so you got to sort of figure out where you are in that continuum and say, okay, I tend to react too quickly. So in a tough situation, I probably need to slow down a little bit, get some input, wait, and wait. Um, and then the people on the other side say, I tend to just wait too long and never do anything. So if I'm going to err, I need to sort of push myself to act more quickly than I normally would. And that helps us get towards the middle, right? Where
Hmm.
we're more likely to sort of, we want to, part of life is avoiding big mistakes, right? I
Hmm.
mean, it's one thing to cut yourself, it's another thing to cut off your hand, right? And
Hmm.
so if we can sort of stay in that middle and it's like, yeah, I probably could have handled that better, but nobody died,
Right.
and so sometimes we have to understand our bent as a person and personality and sort of push against that a little bit to help us move towards the middle.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point because I'm more likely, much like yourself, someone sends an email and I'm like, what? And like CJ in the chair goes sideways, right? Then I'm like, okay, just get up, type the email, get all your emotional whatever's out, and then, come back the next day because I'm too responsive. And then there are other people who just wait and it festers like a wound and gets
Right.
infected and it gets worse. I'm not sure which is better because I think both can do damage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. We only have 7 minutes. Can we talk about? So I think we've talked about how to quit your job. What? How
Uh,
do you avoid being hired by a toxic waste? And we may not be able to finish all of this, but I
no, but
think
we can give a good start.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So what are some things
So,
to that you'd look at?
well, again, it's one of the things that culturally we tend to think about jobs and good jobs is it's about what you do. Okay, if
Hmm.
you're an accountant or
Yeah.
you're a marketing executive or whatever. But in actuality, a large part of the variables of what a good job is has to do with its setting, right?
Hmm.
I mean, what we're talking about here and how are decisions made, and is it positive and supportive or is it critical? Um, and so part you not only find out what you can do, but what's the place like? Okay. And so
Mm.
we've got to do a little bit of detective work to the best of our ability. People in the that may be uh, either used to work there or the company sort of has a rep, or you talk to customers who or vendors that work with that and say, what's your experience been like that? And also one of the things, so the flip side of it is places that make bad hiring decisions are usually in crisis, right? And so
Mm.
we got to fill this. We need to fill it today. And so if you're looking at a job and it's where they talk to you, they interview you tomorrow and hire you later that day,
Red
beware
flag.
because
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, because they unless there's some unusual circumstance, that means that they're just cranking through stuff and there's probably something not wise going on. Now you
Right.
could, so the, and also you don't, when possible, you don't want to just talk to the HR manager because you're not going to work for the HR manager, right? You need to talk to, some form of leadership. If it's not the supervisor, maybe, go and see if you can, as part of the interview process, you have the right to have an interview process too. I mean, they're looking for you and you bring value and say, I'd like to meet with some of the people that do this job and sort
Right.
of hear what it's
Absolutely.
like. And we get totally passive and sort of like, they're in charge and I'm just this peon and I'm praying that they'll hire me. That's not the way it is. You have value and you're investing your life. You want to make sure that it's a place you want to work. So in the booklet, I just talk about different ways to be able to sort of do that research and find out what the place is like and sort of those warning signals that
Hmm.
you want to avoid.
But here's the thing that I heard that I think is really important that you said that until this moment I haven't told my clients to do, which is to ask like, how are decisions made? Tell me, like, if you're in an interview and you have like the 5 or 10 minutes at the end to ask a question, it's like, tell me about a really hard decision that you made and how was that decision made? Who was
Hmm.
involved in the decision? Was it the people in the group that was going to be impacted by it or not? Like, how were decisions made? How did communications, when did communications not go so well, and then what happened? But there's a whole bunch of questions that you can probably ask about the things that you're just mentioning to see if it's toxic or not. And I would never have even thought of asking this because I do think you're exactly right. We are more focused on, oh, what kind of company is this? You're focusing on the job itself and not, focusing on the task, but not the relationship and the people that you're going to work with. But I just think that that's a brilliant idea of asking those kind of questions during, when you talk to ex-employees, when you talk to vendors. I don't know how you would find vendors, though. Is that hard? Have you ever talked to a vendor? I don't know if I've ever done that. I've talked to employees.
Um, well, it's more if you're in that industry and you know that these people provide services to them. And it's not like you're sort of cold calling them, but it's sort of like you have a relationship with somebody that, provides food to a restaurant or whatever, you can sort of get a sense that way. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little bit informal.
Yeah. And then there was an idea of shadowing someone in the department. I thought, wow, that would be great, but I don't know if many people allow me to do it. Have you heard of people allowing you to shadow
Well,
someone?
sometimes it's earlier in the process. It's not like you're necessarily interviewing, but you're sort of thinking about either transitioning fields or moving on, and you can sort of frame it as an informational interview and say, I'm trying to get to know the field and sort of what's on out there, and so I'm wondering if I could, you know, shadow somebody for a half a day or whatever, and just see what life is like, in, let's say, in a newsroom at a TV station or whatever it is, and so when you're already involved in the interview process, it's probably tough to pull off,
Right.
unless, I mean, you can always ask and say, uh, this is an important decision to me, and it'd be helpful for me to sort of know what daily work life looks like. Would I be able to just hang out with somebody for a while and I can sign a non-disclosure agreement, so that I'm not, spying for somebody else, a competitor or whatever. And you never know until you ask. And
Yeah.
I live in the Midwest, and cultures different in different parts of the country, and also what size of cities you live in and what your industry. Sometimes it's like, yeah, big deal, come on, and we'd love to have you along. And
Right.
others are like, that ain't happening. Well, let me talk with legal first. Well, then that's not happening when they got to,
Right.
consult with
Yeah.
legal. So
But that's a brilliant idea. Actually, I think that the whole idea of shadowing, I would usually suggest that for clients who are thinking about going into a new industry. Like, oh, I really would like to go into this new industry. It's like, well, why don't you ask like someone to go, and, to talk to them, pick their brains, and shadow. But I like the idea of if you're enough of a planner, right, and you think, okay, I really would like to work for Amazon, let's say, and I don't, probably 6 months from now, I'd like to apply for a job. You could easily probably talk to someone going, hey, can I like check out the warehouse and just see what it's like? Can we meet you for
yeah.
lunch and just walk around? I get it. Okay, got it. And then, oh, we ran out of time. Gosh, darn it. There's like an infinite number of things I can talk to you about. Paul, you're fantastic. So
Okay.
we've been talking to Paul White, and we've been talking about how to decide when it's time to quit your job, and then also how to avoid being hired by a toxic workplace. So if folks actually want to get these booklets, they can go to your website, right? And
Yeah. Our website, appreciationatwork.com, and it's the word at, so appreciationatwork.com, has all stuff about five language appreciation, toxic workplaces, building a culture of appreciation, all that kind of stuff.
okay, excellent. Thank you so
Sure,
much.
my
Thanks
pleasure.
again.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show and would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.